In this video, we will be discussing the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's elected in an overwhelming landslide in 1932 with the promise that he would do whatever it took to end the Great Depression. He promised a New Deal for all Americans. We'll look at his New Deal and how it represented a fundamental change in the role of the federal government. President Roosevelt's New Deal had three goals, known as the 3 R's. The first R stood for Relief for the Needy. These were emergency relief programs to help Americans hardest hit by the Great Depression. They will focus on the short-term help for those who need food, shelter, etc. The second R stood for Economic Recovery. This goal focuses on creating jobs. FDR will create several jobs programs to put Americans back to work. The third R stood for Financial Reform. This goal focuses on reforming the financial system so another Great Depression doesn't happen. FDR will regulate the banks and the stock market to prevent another financial crisis. On taking office, FDR launched a period of intense activity known as the First 100 Days, lasting from March 9th to June 16th, 1933. During this period, Congress passed more than 15 major pieces of New Deal legislation, which significantly expanded the federal government's role in the nation's economy. FDR used fireside chats over the radio to explain in clear, simple language his New Deal measures. These informal talks made Americans feel as if FDR was talking directly to them. FDR realized that in order to get the country out of the Great Depression, he would have to adopt an economic policy of deficit spending. This meant that you spent more than you earned. FDR wanted to jumpstart the economy by putting more money into it. This economic theory is called Keynesian economics. According to this theory, the federal government should use deficit spending on infrastructure projects like building bridges, schools, and roads to create jobs and stabilize wages during the Great Depression. The 18th Amendment, which went into effect in 1920, was very unpopular. Crime rates soared as gangsters like Al Capone became rich by providing black market alcohol. The government was unable to fully enforce prohibition. Over time, a political movement grew to repeal the 18th Amendment. The government saw alcohol as an opportunity to raise tax revenue and put thousands of Americans back to work. The 21st Amendment was passed in February of 1933 and ratified by the end of the year. It is the only amendment that repeals another amendment. An easy way to remember this is that you can buy alcohol at 21, but not at 18. The U.S. had been on the gold standard since the 1830s. It was also built into the framework of the Federal Reserve System. By law, the Federal Reserve was required to hold gold equal to 40% of the value of the currency it printed. It also had to convert those dollars into gold at a price of $20.67 per ounce of pure gold. During the Great Depression, large quantities of gold flowed out of the Federal Reserve. When it could no longer convert any currency into gold, President Roosevelt declared a national banking holiday. The Emergency Banking Act gave the president the power to control domestic gold. On April 20th, FDR suspended the gold standard. The nation's currency could be backed by silver, or the value could be changed by the government, also known as fiat money. This raised the value of gold and lowered the value of the dollar. It then raised the prices of commodities. It helped debtors, banks, and businesses alike. It lowered prices of American goods abroad, encouraging exports, and raised prices of foreign goods in the U.S., discouraging imports. Historians believe that this accelerated the recovery from the Great Depression. As a part of the first 100 days of legislation of the New Deal, the FERA was aimed at responding quickly to the economic crisis of state and local governments created by the Great Depression. Federal grants were given to states to provide assistance to those in need. Such assistance included general work relief programs, education programs designed to employ jobless teachers, part-time work for college students, direct cash relief for those unable to work, rural relief programs. The PWA built dams, bridges, hospitals, and schools across the country and employed thousands of Americans. It was created by the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NIRA. With so many Americans unemployed, FDR tried to put Americans to work. One of his programs was called the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. It put young men aged 18 to 25 to work, building roads, developing parks, planting trees, and helping in soil erosion and flood control projects. You earned $30 a month, but $25 was sent home. You were given free food, uniforms, and lodging in a work camp. Almost 3 million young men had worked for the CCC when it closed in 1943. They planted more than 200 million trees. Many of them were in the Great Plains, trying to prevent another Dust Bowl from happening. By 1933, there were widespread bank failures across the country. On his first full day in office, FDR got Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act. It created a one-week holiday for the banks. The Treasury Department went around the country and inspected every bank. If the bank was on sound footing, it could open the following Monday. If it was completely insolvent, couldn't pay off its debts, it remained closed. But if it was somewhere in between, it could receive loans to help it ride out the current crisis. The Saturday before the banks opened, FDR gave his first fireside chat to explain to the nation how banks work and what his administration did during the bank holiday. The country listened to him, and within the next few weeks, people were bringing their money back to the banks. The Tennessee Valley Authority helped the rural region in and around Tennessee. It provided navigation, flood control, electricity, and other economic development in the Tennessee River Valley, a region hard hit by the Depression. It was also meant to modernize the region's economy and society through federal funding. The TVA covers most of Tennessee, parts of Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. The National Recovery Administration, or NRA, was an agency established by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. The goal of the administration was to eliminate cutthroat competition by bringing industry, labor, and government together to create codes of fair practices and set prices. The NRA was created by the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, and allowed industries to get together and write codes of fair competition. The codes intended to reduce destructive competition and help workers to set minimum wages and maximum weekly hours, as well as minimum prices at which products could be sold. The NRA also had a 2-year renewal charter and was set to expire in June of 1935 if not renewed. Unfortunately, it would later be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. FDR also wanted to help farmers, probably the hardest hit because of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. Congress passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which sought to raise crop prices by lowering production. The federal government paid farmers to plant less crops. This would also be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in a case we will discuss later. The next thing FDR and Congress tried to do was to regulate the stock market to prevent another Black Tuesday. Congress passed the Federal Securities Act, which required corporations to provide complete information on all stock offerings and made them liable for any misrepresentations. It created the Securities and Exchange Commission, whose job was to prevent stock speculation and buying on margin. Congress took another step to reorganize the banking system by passing the Glass-Steagall Act. It created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. The FDIC insured individual bank accounts of up to $5,000. The FDIC reassured Americans that their money would still be there, so they left it there or returned it when the banks reopened. Under the National Industrial Recovery Act, Congress gave the President the power to regulate industry for fair wages and prices that would stimulate economic recovery. In Schechter Poultry v. the U.S., the Supreme Court ruled that Congress cannot give the President this power, and the NIRA is unconstitutional. The Agricultural Adjustment Act placed a federal tax on crops and animals. The money from that tax would then be paid to farmers that promised to reduce the amount of crops grown. In U.S. v. Butler, the Supreme Court ruled that the AAA is unconstitutional because only states have the power to regulate agricultural production, not the federal government. Since 2 of FDR's programs were overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, FDR proposed a plan to add 6 new justices to the Supreme Court for every justice over the age of 70.5. This would put the total up to 15 justices. He would then select those 6 justices, changing the makeup of the court. This was called his court-packing plan. His court-packing bill failed, but he got his wish with 7 of the 9 judges retiring during his tenure in office. He still got to fill the Supreme Court with justices who favored his New Deal programs.